All right, we are live. So thank you all for joining us this morning at our second FC Build conference. So since many of you in the audience are new to FC Build, let me start with a short introduction to Foundation Capital. So we were founded in 1995. We're an early stage venture firm managing order of magnitude 4 billion in capital, and more than 30 of our companies have gone public over the years. We've backed some pretty extraordinary entrepreneurs over the last 2.5 decades, and in our enterprise practice in particular, we've been fortunate to partner with founders in enterprise infrastructure up and down the stack. So from cloud, data, AI, automation, DevOps, as well as B2B SaaS and cybersecurity. So we primarily lead seeds and Series A's, usually before the company has any revenue or even a product. And basically we invest in extraordinary dreamers with extraordinary dreams and work with them to make it real. So with that, speaking of extraordinary dreamers, please allow me to introduce you to our speakers, Artur Bergman and Peter Shafton. By way of background, Artur is founder, chief architect, and chairperson of Fastly, which he started actually 10.5 years ago, and which provides real-time content delivery network services. Prior to that, he served as a CTO at Wikia, managed LiveJournal's engineering team, and was an operations architect in the way back days at 6apart. Peter is the vice president of architecture at Twilio, which he joined over 10 years ago when it was just 20 employees. At Twilio today, Peter is responsible for incubating and, as necessary, acquiring projects and technologies that help advance Twilio's infrastructure and roadmap. Before Twilio, Peter spent time as an architect at Cisco, Ning, where I also worked, Yahoo, and way back at Silicon Graphics. So with that, maybe I'll just kick it off. We'll kind of actually go back into the Wayback Machine. We were talking just before going live here. And I would love for each of you to just share a very speedy version of why you started in the case of Artur or joined in the case of Peter, each of your companies. What was the sort of motivating thrust of why you started? Maybe Artur, if you don't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's, so nice to be here. So the story actually starts back in 2008 when I joined Wikia, and which is now known as Fandom. And if you think about Wiki, it doesn't really change that often, but when it has to change really fast. And so it's a perfect candidate for caching. And we tried all the commercial providers, and none of them could do it. The fastest was, I think, 7 or 8 minutes update times, and our users revolted. So we built our own. I literally, in 2009, took 2 servers as checked luggage and flew to London and took a cab to Docklands, and that was the first pop. And fast forward 2011, I was looking for what next to do, and it turns out there were a lot of people wanted to use this solution, and so we ended up starting Fastly with Wikia as our anchor customer. So the technology really started developing in 2008, and the company in 2011, and then it took off.
Very cool. Peter, tell us about what was the animating drive for you joining Twilio way back.
Sure, yeah. So I was at Cisco at the time. I was a software architect for Flip. Anybody who remembers the little handheld video cameras with the big red button, we were going to take over the world until somebody invented an iPhone that could do exactly what that thing did. Anyway, so Cisco decided they did not need Flip or the enterprise. And so I started looking around both inside of Cisco and outside. And I ended up meeting up with a friend of mine named Bradley Horowitz, who was at Google at the time. Met with the Google video team. If you look at my background, a lot of time in video and media. And I said, well, the team's interesting, but I don't know if it's a good fit. He said, you should meet with these folks up in San Francisco, Twilio. He's like, we tried to acquire them and Jeff told me to go jump in a lake. So I'd never heard of Twilio, went up and met with Jeff, John, and Evan. The fun part was there was 3 technical founders. It was enabling like the internet to connect to a telephone. Well, I hadn't done with telephony before, a lot of video and audio work. And I loved the fact that it was a problem that solved a problem for other developers. So it was a tool, a lot like what Artur's product did. It solved a niche, and it seemed solely like an execution problem, right? It was cool, people wanted it, it solved a problem, but we just couldn't develop it fast enough. And that seemed like a great place for an architect.
That's a great sort of, I think, segue to the sort of next thing I wanted to just kind of take us back to, which is, so 10 years ago when you were working on that, and if you kind of thought about what was the state of the cloud, and what were the hard problems people were trying to solve, what were kind of the big, what were the big things? AWS was sort of, a few years in, 4 or 5 years in, there were still so many pieces to be built, but what were the really hard scaling issues that you guys were going after? And Peter, maybe if you could just kind of keep going with what you just started to scratch there
Sure.
with Twilio.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the fun thing about AWS when we got there was you have to remember there weren't even SD drives in machines, so your IOPS were pretty crippled. So when you think about like databases and things like that, it was really hard to scale. And I think those were some of the early problems we ran into. You know, how much data do you store? How quickly can you read and write it? You know, the funny part was their network was really set up for HTTP. And they didn't understand for telephone calls, we have these RTP packets that have 20 milliseconds of audio in them. And so you kind of can't have these latencies. You can't drop data. And in their world, listen, it's a web request. Somebody will just retry it, right? The browser will time out and somebody will, I'll reissue. We couldn't do that. And so it took a long time for us to get Amazon to understand what we needed out of their network. And ironically enough, we ended up with the cell phone numbers of all the networking team in all of our, all of our phones, because we just had to call them when anything happened. And we literally knew more about the telemetry of their network than they did at the time. We could tell them when they had latency and drops between regions or even between boxes. So that was definitely the biggest challenge for us early on.
Nice. Artur, how about you? What was state of cloud? What was like, okay, this is why we need to build this. This is not going to be solved by someone else.
So on the cell phone number of, the key players, that is the secret to how the internet works. And I still think it's the secret to how the internet works. All of us have some employees on staff who have the key cell phone numbers to key employees at the other companies, whether competitors or not. And when weird things happen, they call each other and solve it really fast, and it would take forever through any kind of official channel. And I think this exists in a bunch of different parts of the internet ecosystem with their own social graphs, and whether it's security or networking or similar things. But that is certainly a key thing we have, is the ability to reach right people. I think in a global sense, for customers, the state of cloud is actually the same, which is they have large legacy systems and they still don't really know how to move them. And that's still the case for us. It really actually goes to that latency issue that Peter just mentioned. I'd like to actually get the control that we needed to deliver low latency around the world. And the lack of SSDs are a key thing too. We could never build what we wanted to do on top of the AWS or GCP, coupled with the fact that their egress charges are egregious. And so if you have a business where you get paid partly on egress, your margin is then completely dictated on your ability to negotiate your egress rate with people who don't negotiate egress rates. And so, that's an economical part, but really it was the fine control on the low latency stuff, low latency responses. And if you go to our website, look at our network map, we display, our average hit time for cache hits, and it's 0.2 milliseconds. I think on the 99th percentile, it's still under a millisecond. And even today, I think that's nearly impossible to do in a cloud environment, or it's really, really hard.
Yeah. And the CDN, the kind of traditional CDN players were not anywhere close to that from a performance level, my recollection.
No, as far as I can tell, they still aren't. But.
Yeah. All right, so that's sort of the 10-year look. So now, you guys are advising founders when they begin to think about starting something in and around infrastructure in the cloud. I think one of the things that we found super helpful with our inaugural FC Build last year was the sort of sharing of some of those kind of unforgettable lessons learned from your startup experiences. What were some of the early oh shit moments where you kind of called into question everything you thought you knew about the problem you were solving and had to kind of revisit things and re-architect or refactor. I'd love for you to just kind of dig into a couple of those examples. What precipitated it? How did you guys wrestle them to go to the ground? And maybe Peter, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Yeah, I think data is the one that resonates with me the most. When I got to Twilio, you think of some companies, they usually have one founder that's sort of the data guy. We didn't really have a data guy, so I sort of became that, which is funny if you look at my background. But thinking through how you're going to accumulate data, where you're going to store it, what your retention policy is. Most of us have been engineering long enough. We know, listen, we're always going to set the clocks to GMT. We're going to capture data in UTF-8 because those are all going to be a problem downstream if we don't think about it now. But what a lot of us don't think about is like, how are we going to shard when we get to scale? Are we going to keep data forever? How do we think about that? What will the performance be if this thing really takes off in 4 or 5 years? And so that was exactly the problem we ran into, right? We thought it was really interesting that we keep a record of every text message you had ever sent and every call you had ever made. And originally that was in one system, one database conceptually. And if you think about it logically, what's going to happen in 5 years and 6 years? So it's exactly right. You ended up accumulating so much data that even simple things like just altering schemas to add a field or add an index took forever. It was not uncommon for us to spend 3 weeks waiting for a replica to come up.
Wow.
And so, in the early days, thinking like, well, how are we going to do that split? And we ended up splitting out in-flight data, which is the data we need to right now to manage a call. Like, hey, you want to queue it, you want to transfer it to somebody else, versus what happened 6 years ago. Like, I still have online the first text message Jeff ever sent. And so being thoughtful about data is one of the hard things. And the funny story there was, I literally had a countdown clock. So I talked about the fact we didn't have SSDs. We could only store so much data on the disk, and we used to store both the backup, and when we bring up a replica, we'd have to pull the backup out of the cloud and then untar it onto the file system. So we could do the calculation at the rate at which data was coming in when we run out of disk space. And so literally on the lead engineer's clock and on my desktop, we had countdown clocks. It said, listen, November 16th is the day we turn off Twilio. And every day our manager would walk by and we said, listen, are you going to let us deal with this problem? Because that's the date we turn off the company. And eventually, like, I think it was mid-October or something, they said, is that real? And we said, actually, we think we're off a little bit. We've been going faster than we expected. You better let us deal with this. And so we did, but that was an early panic moment.
And so did you, in that case, did you literally stop all other projects to say, like, we got to basically throw all the resources at this?
We grabbed our strongest engineers, conception. We said, listen, here's what we're going to do. We're going to split in flight and post flight. It ended up, we actually had to reach out to one of our top customers, ask if we could delete a bunch of their data, because conceptually the database was getting so big that they couldn't even fetch it. Like, the time for the GET requests to do a list resource would be 500-600 milliseconds, and it was coming in at more than 1,000 records per second anyway. So they couldn't pull it out at the rate. So we basically had to beg somebody to let us delete their data so that we could do the operations necessary to split it apart, create shards of post-flight. Now, as an example of the messaging system, is 19 shards of MySQL clusters on 16 XLs.
Holy moly. Yeah, I can imagine all the debates around how to shard it by customer, by kind of data type, but
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And also the other hindsight here is charge for it. we give that data away for free. We charge you to send the message. We don't charge you to fetch it later. So in hindsight, that probably would have been a good call, but it's too late now.
Interesting. Yeah, really smart. I mean, to have known that sort of ex ante to sort of, the impact that would have had on your business model, because my guess is the default for most customers would have been, of course, I want to save all this. But anyway, Artur, all right, man, I know you've got some scar tissue. We've talked about it over the years. Let's hear how you guys got banged around a little bit, what you learned, and how it informs your, how you advise startup founders today.
Yeah, the charge for it is, I think, a really important message in general, and especially charge for it. I've really come to appreciate aligning your what you charge for with the benefit of the customer, right?
Yeah.
Like we have some competitors that charge for packets transmitted, not bytes. So their revenue will actually go up if they have more packet loss, which, if you look at it from a cost point of view, it makes sense. If you look at it from a benefit for what the customer is buying, it's a terrible incentive, right? We have one competitor that charges more for cache misses than cache hits, which is also a terrible incentive. And so with things like storage, I mean, there are things we should have charged for because it aligned both with value and with our cost that back then we didn't really think about. A lot of the things we've learned, we've distilled into a concept called 0-1 infinity, which I ran into when I was reading some 1970s language design, and it really deals with like big O notation scaling. It comes from language design, states that a system should be designed from an algorithmic point of view to accept 0, 1, or an infinity of an item. And for things like, our billing, did not anticipate customers coming and saying, could you please give us an invoice where all of our 500,000 customers are individually itemized?
Wow.
Right? Because our billing system was not designed to have an infinite number of inputs, right? And so you find these places all over our system where we kind of assume that, oh, let's say, one day we'll have 100,000 customers. That will be great. This system doesn't need to handle more than that. But then a couple of years later, as the systems have evolved and our customers have evolved, you run into these hard limits, a little bit like that, you didn't charge the storage, right? Like,
yeah. So Arturo, how does that not, because I love this concept of like thinking of scale from day zero. The thing that I am sort of wondering, and I'm sure sort of you guys have discussed and debated, is how do you make sure that doesn't slow you down when going from 0 to 1 if the goal is to just test something out and learn?
So that's why I said infinity on the algorithmic level, so that you know how you can solve it, right?
Got it. So the theoretical is there, but the practical may not be there yet.
Correct. That's right. I mean, we don't have an infinite amount of computing, right? So there is limits, but yeah. So like, think through what will happen if someone comes and says, "I would like to buy, 10 million of this," and you're like, "Oh, we have a hard limit of 500, right?" Like, so it is a tension though, in like where do you draw that line? And for us, it's now like at least have a plan for, and don't dig yourself into a hole that makes this harder, right?
Yeah.
And from the look back for us, and this cloud makes this so much easier, is really around like capacity planning and generations. And there was this, I think one of the most defining moments in the company's history from architecture technology point was, our largest POPs were like 6 machines, and we were like dramatically running out of capacity. And well, we didn't think we were, but then we suddenly realized that we were going to. The clock was moving faster, and we had this new POP design that would scale up to 3 or 4 terabits per second, 2 to 3, up from 200 gigs. And we had this plan. We're going to build one. We're going to test it, validate it, and then we realized that, like, if we did that, we would have no capacity. Like, we didn't have time.
Yep.
And so we just raised our A round, and we took, I think 3 months after that, we took half the capital, and we bought 6 of these POPs without having a running example of it, because there was no choice. And I remember we sat around the room, like all the senior technologists, and like, are we going to do this? And it's like, yeah, we believe it'll work. And then the first POP went up, and we got DDoS 2 days later, and like without that POP, we would have completely fallen down.
Yeah, amazing.
And then, so, but I think like from a technology point, that was the riskiest decision we ever, financial / technology, like the riskiest decision we took.
It is fun to look back on those kind of bet the company moments, and it's not always obvious in the moment that is going to be one of them, but it sounds like that for sure was, as you kind of look back on it. I'm curious, maybe one where it didn't go as well, where you had an outage, and I mean, knowing how you're wired, like you're just literally genetically engineered for speed. Like when you guys did struggle with outages, which are inevitable, how did you manage through that?
I think the biggest ones were always the DDoSes.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, now the network is large enough that that's not really a problem, but when we're smaller, and the worst one, which was pretty well known, was the DDoS against GitHub in 2014, 15, one of those years that lasted for around 7 days.
Yep.
And it was at one point, I think day 3, where we looked at each other, what if this is the new normal? Like, we can't deploy code. We can't, like, everyone is working 24/7 shifts. It's clear that the Chinese had way more attackers attacking us than we defending them against them. And like, what are we going to do, right? Like, this just keeps on going. And it led to a lot of changes operationally and staffing and so on. But that one was probably the hardest. And thankfully, our customers understood pretty well what was going on. But yeah.
Amazing. So Peter, I'm going to take it back to you, and I'm going to integrate a question from on board. which is also top of mind, I think, for others. And that is both Twilio and Fastly have had to manage these very interesting relationships with the likes of Amazon, Google, Microsoft. And there is this sort of always on dynamic tension when you're working with these kind of web scale players. And sometimes you're a customer, sometimes a partner, sometimes a vendor. And it is a very tricky dance. We were chatting just before this, about all the kind of companies that are probably a handful of years behind you all, that are now sort of challenging Amazon in terms of changing their licenses and trying to sort of assert their own IP so that they don't kind of get quickly copied. But how have you guys managed this? Because I think this to me feels like one of the most important things for enterprise founders to figure out and to sort of, I would say, stay alert on as they kind of build and scale their companies. But Peter, can you just kind of tell us how you guys manage this at Twilio, and then we'll get Artur's perspective as well?
Yeah, no, and it's an interesting one, right? Like, obviously, Amazon is both an investor in Twilio, ironically enough. We sit on their infrastructure, so we depend on them, and they use us, interestingly enough. So we have a lot of overlap. In the early days, I think we were not particularly savvy, right? And Amazon is quick to offer professional services help and people that will come in, and they have this sort of well architected framework that they provide, and that requires them to interview you, right? Like, what does your systems look like? How are they orchestrated? How are you using Amazon? Partially that's an advantage, understanding what we're utilizing, how you could use S3 or Dynamo or something like that better. But the challenges you're alluding to is they take that information back. And so we learned early on that that started to be a one-way pipe, that they would ask a bunch of questions and nothing came back to us. And we started to see their products appearing with overlap and similarity. And I had to train the engineers to be thoughtful about, listen, here's how you present a problem to Amazon. They don't need to know exactly what we're doing. They need to know a proxy of what we're trying to get done. And they don't need to know the details of the scale in our business necessarily. Yeah. And those are things you have to be careful about. And it works in funny the other way too, right? We had a Signal conference where we were presenting a partnership with Google about real-time transcription and CCAI. And our Amazon rep hadn't been told ahead of time. And when this announcement went live, he got a call from his boss and immediately got pulled back from the Signal conference and had to fly back to Seattle. So there is an expectation on their side that they're going to understand the company they're partnered with, and they will be aware and help keep Amazon informed, right? And Amazon Connect is obviously a competitive to our Flex product at Twilio. Yeah. And so it is a tricky scope, but you need their help, right? These are the same people that give you their network engineers' cell phones and work through problems for you, but you just have to be careful about how you play that game.
Yeah. Yep. Artur, how did you guys manage this or continue to manage it? And you also have, there's other players beyond the web scale folks who you have to kind of manage as well. I mean, this is very tricky.
Yeah, I have a theory, and I'm curious also if Twilio kind of has this benefit too, which is, we are part of the communication layer. So customers have started to realize that if you go all in on AWS or GCP, and that includes your networking, like all your inbound, outbound communication, you will never get a discount ever again. And so then if you want to be multi-cloud, you have to like re-implement your WAF and your load balancing, all of that layer between each proprietary vendor, and they don't want to do that. So there's like a place for by using like an edge cloud like us, where they actually have at least some theoretical credibility when they threaten to be multi-cloud, versus if they're all in, then that threat is completely non-existent. And so I think that is something that's worked to our advantage, but specifically because of the fact that we are a part of the in and out between your end users and your cloud, right?
Yep.
It's for us, it's like we have all the free clouds or all the free companies are customers, vendors, partners, and we have a lot of peering with them on that level. We have we design protocols together with them. There's so many touch points, and it's what Peter said, that you have to be careful. And even with the companies inside, like you can talk to some people inside the company about some things because you know that those people are actually pretty firewalled, but you can't just assume that because you have this one relationship when you're designing protocols where you can go deep on this subject and be safe about it, that just because of that, on another subject with another person, that you can go that deep and be safe, right? Like it doesn't translate that way. And so you have to be, you have to be mindful of that, and then, deliver a better solution.
Yep.
And deliver a solution that works across all the clouds.
There's something that I see consistently in our portfolio as well, which is because Amazon is, I'm just picking them, I could have said Microsoft or Google, is so horizontally focused that really building that kind of customer intimacy and real understanding of their problems is, I think, how you compete ultimately with the web scale players, because they just can't go as deep as you can. And so that becomes, I think, a big part of being able to kind of move more quickly and be more vertically oriented. And as I think, as you both have identified here, being just much more intentional about what you share with whom, and kind of dialing that to the right level. Because Twilio took money from Amazon, I'm curious, and I don't know if, Artur, I don't remember if you guys had taken any money from any of those players. Okay, so you hadn't. But like, were there moments where you felt, Peter, like, wow, like their role as an investor was now starting to influence our roadmap? Or how were you able to kind of resist that?
I mean, it did, certainly. I mean, there's no mystery, right? In this software business, the customers that pay you the most get to move to the front of the queue, right? And so not only was investment, although that was a part of it, was they were consuming a lot of Twilio services, right? SNS and other products they have to sit on top of our messaging infrastructure. And so as they become a big player, they're able to manipulate the roadmap and even, awkwardly enough, inject themselves into calls with our vendors at times. Like a good example, and Artur lives with this, when we're debugging networking problems between carriers and Twilio and Amazon, at times we have to get Amazon on the call there, right? And so now we've exposed who our vendors are, we've exposed that relationship, we've understood how BGP is set up and other pieces that can be troublesome at times. So we avoid that as we would with anybody else, right? Like if Fastly was our customer and they said, listen, I want to get in the line with with your carrier because I'm having issues with you guys and I want to be in that call. Often we wouldn't do that, right? We wouldn't expose who our underlying vendors were, but for them at times we had to.
Yeah, super tricky.
I would echo that. I think some of our large customers have had disproportionate impact on our roadmap, whether they're investors or not. Like they're large customers, right. And exactly what Peter said. I mean, like we have had phone calls where it's like 3 of our competitors, couple of vendors and the customer on one call trying to debug, some very complex sport event happening every February, right? And so like at some point you're like, okay, like you have to do that. But I think it's really the question really is, how do you manage, your very large customers' impact on your roadmap and the trade-off between the revenue from them versus the potential revenue from smaller customers?
Yeah. Yep, it's a tension that I think is unlikely to go away, and is one that many entrepreneurs face. So just maybe shifting gears, I'd love to kind of talk about a little bit about some of the sort of team-related things that you guys have had to sort of figure out. So when I think back to when you both began your journeys at your respective companies, level 5 engineers were not making $500,000 a year. These comp packages have just completely exploded in the last 5-6 years. And this war for talent, particularly for those that can kind of solve the kinds of problems you guys focus on, which have a pretty fundamental sort of infrastructure challenge to them, right? Like these are not solving the world in, world's problems in 140 characters or less. It's like, there's really hard shit to figure out here. And that war for talent, in my experience anyway, it's just never been more intense. So I'm curious, how have your companies really competed for those 100x engineers, and kind of what's been both the pros and cons of the craziness of the last, kind of 22 months? I'm guessing in some senses it could have made it harder, and in other ways it's opened up the market and sort of gotten folks to be more accepting of like, hey, this team's not going to be all in San Francisco or all in in Silicon Valley. So just talk us through sort of this war for talent and how you guys have navigated it, particularly when maybe you were kind of maybe half the size you are today.
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start? I'll shoot for it. So I think in the beginning it was difficult because nobody knew who we were. I didn't know who Twilio was. Nobody else did. So recruiting people into a company nobody's ever heard of with the thought that they might not be there in a year is tough, right? The best you can do is the people that walk in the door, the people that you can find. Young students are great. If you can make the problem interesting and challenging for them and compelling, then that's a good story, right? There is, for Twilio, obviously we had this period of time where we were starting to peak and we had an IPO and then money pulls people in the door, and that's nice. And they already know who you are. And the challenge now where we're at in the pandemic in the last 2 years is people move quickly. They leave jobs, they go to other places, especially we're seeing that. And you're not going to be able to outgun, financially every company. You don't even want to. So I think the interesting thing for Twilio is engineers are half motivated by money and half motivated by the work and the people they work with, right? They want to learn and work with smart people, and they want to be able to work on hard, challenging problems. And I think if you can explain the problem that way, for Twilio, I think it's a really interesting scaling problem. It's very unique. There aren't a bunch of companies that see it or run into it. I think we also have a lot of data, which makes it really interesting for ML and their use cases, right? How many people have potentially recordings of every call, for hundreds and thousands or millions of phone calls, right? And be able to do machine learning and natural language processing and those things. So these are some really interesting problems to solve, and there just aren't that many places to do it. But I think even for simple problems, right? Like I've tried to pitch people on the billing system. Archer talked about the challenge of his billing system. Twilio has the same set of billing challenges, right? We do microtransactions for
Peter,
calls.
I know our billing people and your billing people talk on a regular basis.
It's good. They better.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you get somebody excited about a billing problem? And the reality is it is still just a big data scaling problem. And so if you can find somebody who's excited about that and actually getting to work on and scale that problem, then that's how you get them on board and you get them excited.
Yeah, so that's sort of the challenge, the fundamental interest around what hard problem are we solving here. And obviously you can't be completely out of band on all the other things. What about the sort of last kind of COVID window? Have you guys sort of changed the way you think about building the team, particularly sort of the nerdiest of your nerdy?
We were already pretty distributed. So Twilio is global. We're in, Madrid and Bogota and Tallinn, Estonia, and Bangalore and Malmo, Sweden, and a bunch of other places. So we were already distributed. What we did allow is people to start working what we called hubbles, which is a horrible name, but basically say we'll start to recruit people within 100 miles of any location. So at least there's an office they could go to.
Yep.
And in exceptional cases, we've actually allowed people to just work from home full time. We obviously ourselves have been working from home since the pandemic started.
Yep.
So I went to the office for the very first time yesterday in 18 months or more.
Gotcha. Artur, how are you guys recruiting and retaining these sort of, truly extraordinary engineers and architects?
I think so. When we were smaller, I'm back in 2011, 2014. Most companies in San Francisco are media ad businesses disguised as tech companies, and the kind of hardcore infrastructure engineers don't really want to work there. Right. Yeah. And so they were, like what Peter was saying, like you have a really interesting problem and you have, people who are really want to work in this space. We've been remote, not 100% remote, but most people could be remote for a very long time. And a lot of teams were organized around time zones. So that was a very strategic advantage pre-pandemic that kind of disappeared during the pandemic, except I think we just had more experience doing it. And the real downside of it is it's really hard to hire junior people when you are doing it that way, but you end up with senior. And I think we'll just see what happens. I think the core fundamentals of give people, pay them a wage that that is good enough, right? Like you can't be, a fraction of what they could make somewhere else, but you don't need to beat everyone. And then give them an environment where they can ship things and get things done, see it in the hands of users, and have a good work environment. And that's kind of how you have to do it. And for some people that means let them publish, right? Like let them publish papers. For others, let them speak
Yep.
at conference. For others who don't want to do anything like that,
You're
don't
bringing
force
up
them
such
to
a
do
good
that.
point around that. I remember, and this was specifically a way that we were able to, I'm speaking on behalf of one of my portfolio companies where I kind of do quite a bit of work to help them hire. But because some of this is in the ML space and specifically sort of ML infrastructure, and many of their prior employers would not let them publish. And to be able, I mean, and as you know, in this field, particularly where, a third or a half of the most interesting people are coming out of, PhD programs or dropouts from PhD programs, they've been taught like, oh, I have to be able to share my best ideas. And so being able to do that, I think, was a huge unlock for us. And I think has even changed some of the policies of some of those large players. You also made me think, Artur and I we were, riffing on this a little bit before getting started, is how different your backgrounds are, both of you. I mean, one of you's an architect, the other's a dropout. You've kind of worked in, in these sort of really hard technology roles, oftentimes cross-pollinating ideas from one to the other. Peter, I think when you and I chatted a couple of weeks ago, I think literally every feature and function at Twilio you had some hand in working on. But today you're both builders, but you've also been able to, over the last couple of years, sort of transition into these roles that allow you to kind of look a little bit further out on the horizon. So I'd love to kind of get your perspectives as you kind of zoom forward, 2 or 3 or 4 years. What are some of the really big architectural shifts that you're excited about? Even if not necessarily through the lens of of your companies, but like, what do you think is coming and people will be excited and be talking about in kind of 2 or 3 or 4 years with respect to sort of architecture at cloud scale?
You want to go first, Artur?
Artur, go for it.
Go for it.
Sure. I mean, not technically on that side, but the promise of the we were just talking about that before we got on, right? Like the promise of the fast satellite-based internet providers to reach the entire freaking world is really, really exciting to me, right? Like there's, we did some blog posts last year. This goes to Peter's point about big data. That's another way you bring people in. But we wrote some blog posts on digital divide last year, which we used, I think, 66 billion data points of connections over 3 months to get out of. But like, there is significant disparity in access. And you can actually, like, if you plot latency of the world, faster to slower, like you can see state boundaries, like you can see poverty, like it's really clear. And so this idea that like you can just get 25 millisecond latency and 200 megabits pretty much wherever you are, I think is really exciting. And I think every time we give more people more bandwidth and less latency, new applications appear, right? And we can't really always predict those, or I think we rarely can predict those, but we do know that like we build it and they come, right? Like you get more capacity to people, they will figure out how to use it. And so it's just super exciting to me around that, right? Like, and I'm really like, I don't know where it's going to go, but I think it's going to be pretty like massive changes. Yeah.
There was this Carver Mead sort of insight from decades ago now around this concept of wasting transistors, right? Which is like when you have so much excess of capacity, from a technology perspective, amazing things can be built, right? Like the GUI was built because we didn't feel constrained by compute to be able to sort of start wasting transistors on moving a cursor around, right? And to your point, like when that happens more broadly and at even greater pace, really cool things happen. Peter, how about you? What are you most excited about architecturally, and some of the things that maybe even you're working on, or personally, or on your weekends and excited to explore?
Yeah, it's all Bitcoin mining. That's what we're supposed to use extra capacity for, right?
Exactly.
For me, I think the interesting piece is the piece I've been watching, at Twilio. One is the big data migration, right? Like when we started, I spent time at Yahoo and Ning and other places. We're all running big MapReduce clusters, Pig and other stuff. And that's what we were doing, EMR and at Twilio. And then eventually we all move into Redshift, and then from Redshift into Snowflake. And now we're seeing this sort of commoditization of the data infrastructure, right? Like the pieces that are ELT, like Fivetran and High Touch and DBT, and these pieces are enabling us to have better control over where the data lives and to not necessarily have it all in one place. And I think now that we've acquired Segment, this becomes really interesting as to where does your data reside? Can I move it around? Can I use these tools that are kind of ubiquitous to manage that so that I don't have to be locked in, right? Because once you put your data somewhere, historically it was very difficult to move it and time consuming, and that set the course for your company for a decade often. And I remember having this conversation. We went through GDPR at Twilio, and we got paired up with a bunch of companies to discuss, like, how are you facing this? We're like, this is gonna be hard. We've got a lot of databases, and I ended up paired up with the Autodesk team, and they're like, listen, we have databases that are 40 years old. We don't even know how to access them anymore, and we're supposed to somehow redact data records of email addresses from them. How are we supposed to tackle this, right? And now in this world where all of your raw record data can be somewhere, you can control and transform it in the cloud. I think is really empowering, and it overlaps very much with all the compliance standards that we're all being forced to face now. For us, Schrems 2 is a big deal. Like, we won't be able to sell into Europe competitively unless they can control their data. And that was not something we thought about a decade ago, and would have been really hard to do.
I would want to echo that. The data sovereignty issues that are rapidly approaching from like all fronts is it's a hassle for people like me and Peter, but it's also a giant opportunity for both of us and for any startups, actually, because it's a really hard problem that is becoming bigger and bigger.
Yeah, for sure. And your point around sort of the catalyst coming from Europe, we're seeing this for sure across our portfolio. I'm curious, maybe the flip of my question, and I think we hit Bombard's other question with your segment comment, Peter, but I'd love maybe, like, what are some of the the things that we're doing today, whether they're architectural approaches, conventional practices, strongly held beliefs, that are going to look really dumb in a few years? Like, I mean, I think your point around sort of data sovereignty is probably one that's interesting in this bucket. But what are there others where you're like, oh man, like, we just need to let go of this, and it's going to look really stupid from the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of it. Like, it's hard to say that something I'm going to feel stupid about, because I watch and everything seems to come back around. Like, it's all full circle every time. So if you wait like 10 years, we'll be using it again. But it is interesting for me how many companies attempt to build their own API gateways and front doors, right? Like, how much of a hassle that is. Handcrafted APIs. Archer talked about the issues about protecting against DDoS protection, having multi-tenancy protection, having geolocation, having sovereignty. Like, these are problems that other companies are starting to pop up and solve far better than we can. And I think most of us naively go into a space thinking it's easy, right? We joked, I think maybe this was offline at the beginning, about building an email server, right? When you're an engineer in a startup, sometimes you say, well, your boss says, listen, I need us to send email. You're like, this is great. I've got SMTP and a Perl client here. I'll just go do it. And then you realize actually making email get into an inbox is a hard problem. And so I think the thing we'll feel stupid about is all the things we're building that we don't have to. That is just going to proliferate. We see Postman and others having this collection of, how can I find the API or company that does the thing that I really don't need to spend my time doing?
Love that.
Caching.
Love that.
Peter, are you and I dating ourselves by saying Perl?
You saw that email. So how else were we supposed to do that, right?
How about you, Artur? Anything that you're kind of like chuckling, thinking about how stupid it's going to look from the future?
I echo Peter there. Like, you're out there talking to these enterprises, and so they're building the wrong things, and they're like doing it badly, and I think it really is. I mean, it's a circle, right? And so, like, for a while, everyone went all in on microservices and ended up with 1,000 microservices they're going to manage. And so now they're like, oh, we're going to put them all back into a monolith. And you're like, okay, well, it's not either or, right? Like, there's a middle ground everywhere. But it is cyclical, these beliefs, and the extreme of those beliefs rarely makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, like the one that I'm seeing right now, which you see with some of like the Jamstack and stuff, is like, let's go back to static websites and pre-generate the entire website up front. And I have like nightmares to TypePad and movable type, right, from 2004, where we just struggled generating massive amounts of static files. So I'm like, Just fucking cache it. Render it
comes
on
the
the
lamp
fly and
stack.
cache it for a day. Right? Like,
Yes.
why are we, what's the point of pre-generating something and putting it on S3? Like, and then every time you change something, you're now, again, 0, 1 infinity. You're up to 1 million pages. It takes you how long to regenerate for pages that are never accessed, right? Like, that's one I'm seeing now, and I'm just like, haven't we learned this lesson like 4 times over? Like, I'm thinking back to like Vignette and you know, those tools back in the 90s that also were trying to do pre-generation because that was the only way to do it. And now we're back at it, despite the fact that we have amazingly fast computers that can render nearly anything, and you know, massive amounts of RAM that can cache a lot of content, but we're still wanting to pre-generate it and putting it in a massive file system. Like, but
Let's
that's
do this
the
new
one.
again. Well,
Yeah.
we have timed out. You guys are awesome. Thank you, Peter and Artur. What a fun kind of deep dive down the rabbit hole of cool architecture and kind of how to innovate and some cool startup stories. So I'm super duper grateful. Thank you both, and appreciate the questions as well from the audience. And we'll let you guys have a few-minute break.
Sounds good. Thanks, Steve.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye for now.
Bye.